today I have with me Caleigh Copelin, and we're going to be talking about compliance or confusion, the usefulness of blindfolding horses as a handling technique. Caleigh, can you tell me a bit about yourself?
Absolutely. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Guelph, and my primary research focus is actually looking into the welfare of riding lesson horses. But this blindfolding project is something that I've been involved with for a couple years now. We started it when I was in my undergraduate, and then it evolved into a master's project, and then it's evolved into something I worked on along with my PhD. So this research has been a long time coming, and it's really exciting to get to share it with everybody. As for myself, I've been riding horses and working with them for 16 years now. So I am a passionate horse lover, and I really love getting to do equine behavior and welfare research that can help our horses have the best lives possible.
We've all seen blindfolded horses being let out of burning barns in the movies. And where did this theory come from that you can move a scared horse easily if it can't see the danger?
That's a really good question. And the funniest part is we don't actually know. This is one of those things in the equine industry, kind of like the two-finger noseband measurement rule, where it's been passed down as cultural knowledge for generations and everybody accepts it to be true, but nobody can actually trace the origin of the belief. What we do know is that the theory's very old. I'm sure a lot of us, pretty much everyone watching this video, I'm going to assume, has seen Black Beauty, and we know there's a scene in the novel, there's a scene in the movie where Black Beauty is being led from a burning barn, and he's scared. So James puts the blindfold on him to calm him down, and then he's able to be rescued from the burning barn. Now, Black Beauty was written in 1877 by Anna Sewell, and the practices she describes in the book are mostly based on real life horse handling and how that looked back then. So we can fairly say that this theory was being practiced for at least 150 years, but it's likely older than that to be common enough to make its way into Black Beauty. Um, if anything, we could probably argue that Black Beauty actually contributed to public awareness of this technique because most horse people, as I said, have likely encountered Black Beauty's story in one way or another.
So,
I
why
think so.
conduct a study to bust this myth?
I mean, like you said, we were essentially looking to play equine mythbusters with this one. Blindfolding a horse to get it out of a burning barn or a bad situation, it seems like a harmless belief that people would carry. But when we're in an emergency, our higher level thought sometimes shuts down a bit. We revert back to our base instincts. And so if all of our instincts and beliefs say we need to blindfold a horse to get them out of barn fire, that's what people are going to do. And if it turns out that that's not the right move, then we're putting horse and human lives in danger by allowing this belief to continue being popularized in the horse industry. We know that barns burn quickly. With you have hay, wood, shavings, your entire structure is a powder keg, right? So if a barn fire hits, you might only have 90 seconds until the blaze is at a point where your fire extinguishers aren't going to work. Barns can raise to the ground within 6 minutes. So if you're evacuating during a fire, you want to make sure that you save every second that you can, because that can really make a difference between the survival of a horse or a human or both. So in that case, if blindfolds don't do what people claim and they actually make evacuation and horse handling harder, we figured that's information that rescue crews and horse people in general really need to know to keep themselves safe.
And what did you find the typical reactions were when in your study you led a horse when it was first blindfolded?
So when the blindfolds first went on the horses, we saw a lot of them freeze. We know, the typical fight or flight reactions in horses, but they do have a freeze response as well. And we usually see that come out when the horse is stressed or afraid and just feels like they can't escape the situation. So we saw the horses freeze, and we saw a lot of them become very, very still and apprehensive. A lot of them didn't even want to take a step forward, or the ones who did take a step forward, it was 1 foot at a time, 1 foot steps, then a pause, and a hold. Other footsteps, pause, and a hold. It was very tentative. So in the first part of our study, we tested how long it took to lead a blindfolded horse just from their stall out into the aisle of the barn. And we gave the horses a full 60 seconds to complete that task from the time the blindfold was put on. for some of our horses, they couldn't even make it out of their stall in that 60 seconds. Some of them did not move an inch, or some of them just moved too slowly to pass the finish line. But either way, it was not functional for all of the horses. Now, in our second part of our study, we saw a little bit more willingness to move in the blindfolded horses. Our second study was an obstacle course, which we did in an indoor riding ring. Now, in this case, the horses knew they were in an indoor ring instead of a 12 by 12 stall. So I think they were probably a little less concerned about running into things like the stall wall. So they didn't freeze quite as much, but they did still move incredibly slowly. We saw a lot of hesitance, and it was just a lot of reluctance. And even then, some horses failed to move forward at different parts throughout the obstacle course, even when they were in an open arena. The other point I would make about them being a little more willing to move forward in the second part of the study is the fact that that was the second time these horses had worn blindfolds. We used the same horses for both studies. And while there was a period of a couple weeks between those tests, it might not have been as new of an experience to them.
So in general, how much longer did it take to lead the blindfolded horse?
Quite a bit. So in study one, when we were just leading them out of the stall, on average, it took blindfolded horses 35 seconds to be led out of the stall and just into the barn aisle. And the unblindfolded horses took 10 seconds for that. So an average of 25 seconds longer. And again, that's not including some of the blindfolded horses who failed that test because they didn't move at all. And in that test coming out of the stall, we also saw a lot of our blindfolded horses lifting their heads, tossing them, or turning them away to try and avoid walking forward and yielding to lead rope pressure, or they were walking backwards and spinning sideways to evade the ask to walk forward. So in general, we saw the blindfolded horses needed about 5 times more pressure on the lead rope just to get them to walk forward than an unblindfolded horse, which led as a standard horse you would expect them to. And then in the second study, when we were taking them through the obstacle course, so we had 4 different obstacles that we broke the assessment down into. They were asked to weave through pylons on the ground, back up through a set of 2 poles on the ground, walk over a tarp, and then walk between a gate made of pool noodles that would brush their flanks as they walked through them. So at the cones, blindfolded horses took 9 seconds longer to navigate them, and they took 18 seconds longer to back up through the poles than unblindfolded horses. Interestingly, when we got to the tarp, we didn't see a huge difference between our blindfolded and unblindfolded group when it came to the time it took them to navigate the tarp. We assumed that to mean that some horses were more bothered by the sound that the tarp made under their feet when they couldn't see it, and others were more bothered by the sight of the tarp on the ground. So some of them were going to be more slow depending on what type of stimuli they were reacting to. And then at the gate obstacle, that last obstacle with the pool noodles, we actually found the opposite of all of our previous findings. So in this case, the blindfolded horses were quite a bit faster than the unblindfolded horses. They were about 11 seconds faster at moving through the gate. The unblindfolded horses did seem to find the gate pretty visually frightening, and they didn't really want to go near it. Now, to summarize, when you have typical handling processes like leading, navigating stall doorways, backing up, or walking side to side and steering, blindfold has made the horse a lot slower. And they were showing a lot of resistance behaviors, which just made the whole leading process very difficult. Those results I mentioned from the gate obstacle might mean that a blindfold could help your horse navigate something that's visually scary, but any additional handling you have to do before and after is still going to be much slower and much harder. So I really want to stress that when we're talking about time-sensitive emergencies like barn fires, we would not recommend blindfolding. Obviously, we didn't simulate a real barn fire, but you have to consider that visual obstacles are not the only issue with a fire. Fires have frightening sounds, smells, physical sensations associated with them that you can't just block out for the horse. So the idea that you can shut down the fear response or make the horse calm enough to follow you just by blocking out their vision does feel unrealistic when you consider everything else that goes into an emergency situation. So in general, blindfolds just made handling really slow and difficult, and it's probably not worth the seconds that it will cost you in an emergency. You also have to consider that if your blindfolded horse gets loose, you have a whole new emergency situation that you are going to have to deal with.
What are the recommended emergency preparedness protocols when it comes to handling horses?
I know we say it time and time again, but the best thing you can do in these situations is be prepared and have a plan. The last thing you want during an emergency is someone running around like a chicken with their head cut off, because that wastes time that you probably don't have. When you are preparing for an emergency, you want to create evacuation plans and you want to make sure everyone is aware of those plans. But another thing that might actually help is just practice. I mean, we do fire drills at schools, at workplaces, but somehow we never hear about fire drills happening in barns. Now, what was particularly interesting with our study, it was during the obstacle course. Each horse was led through twice. Half of them were led through blindfolded first, half of them were led through unblindfolded first, and then they swapped. Uh, but regardless of if they had been blindfolded going through the course the first time or unblindfolded, we found that the horses' heart rates were lower the second time they went through the course, and they navigated the obstacles a little bit faster. So we were suspecting that the horses were actually starting to get used to some of the scary or difficult things we were asking them to do. They were understanding the patterns. We also found that when we were taking horses out of the stall, they were less resistant when they were turning in the direction of their paddocks as opposed to the direction of the arena. So that's another thing that can help you figure out what the best evacuation route would be. If your horse might have a preferred route out of the barn that they're going to resist less, you can pick that route and then you can practice that type of evacuation to make sure that your horse understands what the procedure is in an emergency. Obviously, your horse isn't going to have the context to understand this is an emergency, you need to act in XYZ ways, but your horse will know the routine and they might be a little bit easier to handle as a result. One other way we can help improve our emergency preparedness within the industry is making sure that our firefighters and our first responders know how to handle horses. Some large animal rescue experts have done informal surveys of firefighters and first responders, and they found that only 5% of these first responders have any experience handling large animals. And as we know, if you don't have horse experience, that can be a pretty difficult thing to engage with, particularly in an emergency where tensions are high. So, what barn owners can do is get in touch with your local fire department that services your area and invite their crew out to your barn for a horse education day. You can teach them basic handling, leading skills, reading equine body language, and in return, they can help you optimize your emergency preparedness plans, planning out the shortest evacuation routes, working with you to identify potential hazards, potential fire risks in your barn. Because the more people you have in an emergency who are able to be calm, knowledgeable, and clear on what the plan is, the higher your chance is going to be for success and for the safety of all of your animals and people involved in the scenario.
Fantastic, Caleigh. Thank you for sharing all those tips on emergency preparedness. And we look forward to your next research study.
Thank you very much for having me here. It was great to talk with you.